Hello, and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality. This podcast is part of GreenDeal-NET, a Jean Monnet network that brings together research and teaching on EU climate and sustainability governance. The EU has taken a wide range of measures to reduce its emissions, and many of these we've already discussed in the previous episodes. In these episodes, we are going to focus specifically on one instrument, carbon pricing, which has really been at the heart of EU climate policy since the beginning with the development of the European Emission Trading System. And recently, the EU has also looked at expanding its use to other sectors and in a more international way. To better understand this topic, we are joined today by Peter Vis, a senior research associate at the European University Institute, and a senior advisor at the Ruud Petersen Public Affairs, and of course an absolute expert on this topic. Hello, Peter. Welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining today.
A pleasure.
So to start with, can you first tell us a little bit about what actually is carbon pricing and how does it help us to reduce emissions?
Well, carbon pricing is really trying to correct something, which is, if you like, the mispricing of an environmental externality, we call it. But imagine somebody came and just dumped rubbish in your garden and just walked away. They didn't have to do anything with it. They just left it there. You would, in order to enjoy your garden, would want to clear that rubbish away, and you would have to perhaps incur some costs in doing that, just taking it away, disposing of it, putting the time it took for you to put the garden right. Now, basically, carbon pricing is to try and introduce a cost for the producers of pollution. The polluter ought to pay for the pollution caused because it does have an impact on others. And ultimately, it has an impact very widely in the terms of climate impacts. And those impacts imply societal costs. Someone has to live with a world that has got more rubbish in it, or in the case of the atmosphere, more greenhouse gases in them. And if you want to actually remove those greenhouse gases, that's costly. For many decades, even hundreds of years since the Industrial Revolution, industry has operated without having to pay for the consequences of its pollution into the atmosphere of greenhouse gases. So carbon pricing is really trying to make that cost more tangible to both the polluters who have to pay the price of carbon. That's what it's designed to do. And of course, that payment is to someone, usually a government, and the government then has more money with which they can act in the public interest, perhaps cleaning up, perhaps subsidizing innovative technologies that are going to remedy the problem. So carbon pricing is trying to correct an anomaly, an economic anomaly where people can dispose of their waste gases at no cost. That shouldn't be the case. And so it's basically trying to put the economics right. And it becomes a possible instrument of policy making. It's not the only instrument. You don't have to use carbon pricing. But it's a very good one because companies are very responsive to price effects, to costs. Generally, they're usually for profit. Companies are working for profit and they try to minimize their costs. So if polluting becomes a cost to them, they are incentivized to try and reduce that cost to as little as possible and eliminate it altogether, ideally. And that's essentially, that carbon pricing is designed to create that incentive to try and clean up the atmosphere of the greenhouse gases that until now weren't paid for.
Mm-hmm.
So.
So it's really, kind of like these two things where you really have, like you said, the polluter that is finally paying for what they're polluting. And then because they suddenly have to pay for it, they might then also be incentivized to pollute less because, okay, now they actually have to pay these costs, whereas before it was without consequences.
Yeah.
So as I said a bit in my introduction, in the European Union, we of course have the emission trading system already for, I think, like 2 decades now. When you look a little bit at the history of it, what are some of the lessons we can learn about how effective carbon pricing can work, and what are maybe do's and do-nots?
Okay. Well, if I may just go back a little even further back than the emissions trading system, which was indeed enacted in law in 2003, so 20 years ago.
Anniversary this year.
Well, for the enactment of the law, yes. Now, in fact, in 1992, the Commission first proposed a CO2 tax, a CO2 energy tax. And that was a proposal made when Jacques Delors was running the European Commission. And the European Union took it to the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit, as it was called in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, as a proposal that they wanted to adopt it within Europe and others to adopt more globally. Now, the difficulty was that this carbon CO2 energy tax never actually was adopted by the European Union. Because to do that, we needed to have the unanimous agreement of all the member states, and that proved to be too difficult to reach. Even with a member state count of about 12 or 15 at the time, it was still too contentious. So what we did was, we tried emissions trading as a second best option. We liked a tax because it is predictable. Companies can, know how much they would have to pay, and it therefore enables them to know exactly what investments are going to be viable and what are not. The disadvantage with a tax is that you're not quite sure what the environmental outcome will be. You put a tax, and if the tax isn't doing enough by way of incentivizing reductions of greenhouse gases, you have to put the tax rate up. Or maybe you put it too high and you can bring it down, So there is certainty about the price, but there isn't certainty with regards to the environmental outcome. Whereas the emissions trading is a bit different because there is a predetermined environmental outcome that the regulator sets at the beginning, and basically the price is what might vary, because it depends a lot on whether companies are going to make an early investment or whether they don't. There are certain unforeseen events that happen, the economy might grow very fast, in which case more emissions are likely to be arising, and therefore there's not enough allowances in an emissions trading system. Or conversely, if there's a recession, there might be less economic growth and there may be fewer emissions, and therefore the allowances might not be so scarce. So the price of the allowances might vary. So basically an emissions trading system doesn't have a predictable price, but it does have a predictable environmental outcome. So it's a different concept from a tax, but it's carbon pricing in another way. Mm-hmm. So there are these different ways. Now, perhaps I should just say that the emissions trading system, how does it work in its essence? Essentially, what the EU did and what many jurisdictions are doing since then is targeting the biggest polluters, the big industries, the energy-intensive industries, or power generators who produce electricity or heat. And in Europe, there are about 11,000 of those installations, and they were the biggest emitters, emitting about half of the CO2 emissions at the beginning of the system. And so they were the ones that were regulated. A law was passed, in effect, that obliged those installations, those companies, to monitor their greenhouse gas emissions. That was a first step. And then at the end of each calendar year, there was an obligation on those companies to hand over to the government enough allowances to match their actual emissions. Now, allowances are bits of paper. They're held electronically on a registry. And there is it's illegal to emit without having an allowance that corresponds to it. So the question becomes, well, how do companies get the allowances? And in the majority today, they have to buy them from governments. 57% of the allowances in the EU's emissions trading system are auctioned by governments. And there are some industry sectors that get given them for free, but it's very rare that they be given all they need. More likely they get less than they need, so they have to go and buy some as well. So that's how they get allowances. And that's where they pay. They pay for those allowances, and that's the cost of carbon. That's the cost of polluting. And every year they have to monitor their emissions, and at the end of the year they have to report on them, have the reports verified by independent verifiers, and then they have to surrender to the government the number of allowances that match their emissions. And, this is the really important bit, over time, the total amount of allowances that are issued declines every year. At the moment by 2.2% per year. From next year it's 4.3% per year, and from 2028 onwards it's 4.4% a year, every year. So there's fewer and fewer allowances over time, and that is why we can be confident that there will be fewer emissions over time, because it's illegal to emit without an allowance. And one day the allowances will be no longer issued. And one would assume then that either companies have been stockpiling allowances, foreseeing that there will be scarcity of these allowances in the future, or they will be switching to technologies which don't involve emissions. And that's, of course, what is intended to happen, incentivizing investment in decarbonized technologies. And these do exist, but they're often very much more costly than the default technology today. But perhaps this carbon pricing mechanism will change the economics of those new technologies, make them more cost competitive, and with scale their costs even might come down, as often happens through technology learning and economies of scale. So we can hope that there will be technologies that will be able to decarbonize industry and power generation, and that is already evident that it's beginning to happen in the power sector. Renewables are much cheaper than they were, contributing a bigger share of electricity production than they did, and we want more of that in the future.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of, it's a bit exciting when you're talking about it, also seeing then this endpoint of then allowances of zero. I think that would be, I don't know when that would be in the future, but I think, the kind of radical transformation that we probably also need to get into this net zero target by 2050. I think it's also interesting how you mentioned these two dynamics of carbon pricing, like also the carbon tax, which a lot of the times when we talk about carbon pricing, at least in the context that I see, it's a lot about these emission tradings. But of course, that's also a way to put a price on what you're polluting. So that's very interesting. When we look at like the EU and the European Green Deal, we see that there's a bit of this expansion of this use of emission trading as a way of carbon pricing. Of course, we have this new ETS for transport and buildings, but also more internationally, we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Can you tell us a little bit more about these two new initiatives?
Yes, well, the extension of emissions trading to the road transport and heating sectors, or household heating sectors, that's a big change, and starts in 2027. And it's going to be slightly different in that it won't be individual transport owners, car owners, who have to report their emissions, nor households who have to monitor and report their emissions. It's going to be the fuel suppliers for those sectors who are going to have to calculate what the emissions would be of using the fuel, and they will have the obligation to buy allowances in an auction to cover the emissions. And then, of course, one would assume the costs to the fuels producers will be passed on to the consumers of fuels through higher prices, which will, of course, incentivize end users to try and reduce their consumption. Now, that's how the mechanism works. It's slightly different from big companies who have the capacity to monitor and report their emissions.
Yeah, that's probably difficult for like individual people
Of
to
course.
really get an overview of this. So that's already like an interesting change that somehow, yeah, the responsibility for a lot of the administration kind of shifts.
It does on the
towards
big
these
suppliers.
big things.
Yeah, and they've got the capacity to do that.
Yeah.
And also, I might just say that that does, as a policy, risk having impacts on vulnerable households or vulnerable transport users, and that can be addressed through the revenues that are generated by the governments auctioning those allowances to the fuel suppliers. Those revenues can be recycled, and part of the extension of the emissions trading system to those sectors has been the creation of a social climate fund to address fuel poverty for the households who are going to be vulnerable and who shouldn't be made precarious because of the fact they can't afford heating. There is a recycling then of revenues to address equity issues, which I think politically was a very important precondition to this happening.
And if anyone listening or watching is interested in this, we also had a previous episode specifically on like the social dimension of the European Green Deal. And the Social Climate Fund is one of the things we discussed. So you can go to the episode with Amandine Crespi and get more information about that. So that's kind of then the extension of the EU ETS to these other sectors. Then, okay, this CBAM, this Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, how will that work?
Okay, well, look, that system has just started and it's new. Basically, it will be that imported goods, certain categories of imported goods, will have a charge levied on them according to the embedded carbon in those goods, in the production of those goods. Now, why is this opportune now? Well, basically, what the EU has done is it's decided to apply this carbon border adjustment mechanism to a number of energy-intensive goods: iron and steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity. Those are the 6 categories that will be covered by the scope of CBAM. So imports of those goods into the European Union will be triggering this charge. The charge will depend upon the embedded carbon in those goods. There will have to be a monitoring and reporting of that embedded carbon from the country where these goods were produced. And so the obligation is for the importer or his representative to make those reports. Those reports will require the cooperation of third country producers who will have to disclose data on both the direct emissions of producing those goods, for example, from a blast furnace, if it's steel, but also indirect emissions if you're making the steel through an electric arc process where you're using electricity. So the reporting has to be done, and when those goods are imported into the EU, a charge is levied, which is the same as the emissions trading price that particular week. Every week, the price of these CBAM certificates that are required now, importers have to buy from governments these CBAM certificates, and these certificates the pricing of them is linked to the emissions trading price in the auctions that take place on an equivalent weekly basis. So there's a very comparable charge being imposed on imports of goods, which until now haven't been paying that. So there has been a risk that our EU producers of those goods are trying to sell products that have in them the regulatory costs of carbon, because the European law requires that those costs be incurred. And the competition from overseas doesn't have. So it's got the price advantage. And that might tempt our producers to relocate outside Europe. And that would not be something the European Union wants to see. So in order to disincentivize that risk of relocation of jobs and growth outside Europe, that's generally called carbon leakage. We don't want to see carbon leakage. So we want those companies to stay in Europe. And in order to help them stay in Europe, we need to have the same treatment for the same goods, whether or not they're produced in Europe or imported into Europe. That's the principle. So it's carbon pricing with a global dimension, because we do import goods in the categories that are going to be covered by CBAM from all over the world. So China, India are countries, for example, who produce steel, iron and steel products that will be imported into the EU and which will be covered by the CBAM, which means they're actually, there will have to be a charge. Now, who is in fact paying that charge on importation? Well, strictly speaking, it's the European consumers who they no longer have this access to these cheap imports that aren't bearing the cost of carbon. However, third countries are not too keen on this because their products become more expensive in Europe and are therefore a little bit less competitive than they were before. So they see this rather as a tax on them, whereas the European Union sees it as treating all goods the same, regardless of where they come from, so not discriminatory. And I mean, it's just one of the things that are being discussed at the COP right now in Dubai. There is a certain animosity towards the CBAM by some developing countries, particularly the emerging economies. The BRICS environment ministers in 2021 made a statement saying that they really weren't happy about there being a CBAM applied in Europe. But really, this is a necessary step for the European Union, and it hasn't been taken lightly. We've been doing emissions trading for 18 years already without having had it. But the more ambitious we are, and the higher the cost of carbon in Europe, the more it hurts our producers to be having third country imports not having to bear those same regulatory costs. And all we're trying to do is level the playing field.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, like how you also kind of frame it not only as like like a global or like an external measure, but also something that will really like help the EU as well to reduce its emissions, because now you have all these energy intensive industries that you said might be like harmed by this, or that might move their production like abroad. So by having like the same price for everyone, that also like enables the EU to then perhaps move a bit faster and also target those sectors that are more at risk of its emissions like moving abroad. So that's quite interesting. Something that you mentioned already is that not everyone of the third countries is happy with it. When we were talking about the ETS for like transport and then heating, you mentioned some equity considerations. Are there also some of these built into the CBAM where it's perhaps looking at like, okay, this is really like a developing or like an emerging economy, so perhaps their industry don't have the same capacity or to move as fast?
Well, I think that's a really good point. And I must admit that I was surprised that the EU has decided to the revenues generated by the sale of these CBAM certificates is going to go to the EU budget. I was surprised by that because I thought it might be more politically astute to put it into a fund for international climate finance to pay for adaptation in the least developed countries or for mitigation all over the world, but particularly perhaps directed towards the poorest countries. Now, the EU budget does contribute to international climate finance in part, but it does many other things as well. It pays farmers in Europe to produce food and feed, and it produces, it pays for the research program in Europe and many other things, regional funding and such like. So that, from a perception point of view, isn't a great look. But the fact is that that was what was decided when the CBAM was created. But I might emphasize that the CBAM is not, first and foremost, a revenue-raising instrument. To be honest, the revenues won't be that great until the mid-2030s, because we have to treat imports fairly And because at the moment the emissions trading system allows some industry sectors, those particularly covered by CBAM, many of those sectors are allowed free allocation under the emissions trading system. They get some of these allowances for free. We have to be sure to give the same amount of benefit to imported goods as if they were receiving the same proportion of free allowances. Otherwise, it would be discriminatory. And what the EU has said repeatedly is that they want this and they think it is compatible with the WTO rules governing international trade in goods. So it tries to be fair. But perhaps there's one thing I can mention, because there is an opportunity not to pay the CBAM charge. There are two opportunities, most obviously. The first is not to have embedded carbon in your goods. Yeah. If you can produce aluminium using hydroelectricity, you're in a good place because your aluminium is not going to have any embedded carbon when it arrives in Europe, so it's going to get in without incurring the CBAM charge. The other possibility is that you, as a third country outside Europe, introduce your own carbon pricing mechanism nationally, and any carbon price paid in the country of production can be offset against the CBAM liability. So that can reduce your liability in Europe to pay Europe. So, for example, supposing the carbon price in Europe is 60 and the carbon price in China is 10. Well, if the EU institutions deem that the Chinese ETS is good enough to qualify for this rebate or exemption, whatever you might call it, it's neither actually a rebate nor an exemption. I think it's called a reduction of the CBAM liability. But if the EU thinks the Chinese system would get that reduction, it would just deduct the 10 euros that have already been paid in China from the 60 euros that is due on importing into Europe. So there'd be 50 net to pay and the Chinese can keep their 10 euros. It's not like the Europeans are going to lay claim to that. Yeah. So the idea is that the carbon price paid on the goods is the same as it is in Europe, but it doesn't mean that it all has to be paid to Europe. So there could be a developing country which introduces a stringent ETS, as stringent as the EU, and which gets, therefore, a full reduction of its CBAM liability. And it, in so doing, actually generates revenues from its own producers of energy-intensive goods that are exported from that third country and imported into Europe. And that revenue can, of course, serve whatever purpose the third country government thinks is appropriate. The only thing they can't do is give it back in some other way to the industry that's produced those goods. Okay, so there's there's conditionalities on how the carbon pricing system works. But the premise is that this CBAM is trying to encourage carbon pricing to be deployed in all sorts of countries across the world. It is a good economic instrument, an environmental instrument, and it's proved in Europe to be very powerful because market forces are powerful. Every country had carbon pricing at a level of the EU, there wouldn't be a reason to have a CBAM. It's only come about because that isn't the case today. But let's hope that one day we might get much closer to that situation.
Yeah, that we might not need it at all anymore. I think it's good to try to imagine those kind of stuff as well. Which brings me to my final question for today's episodes. I like to end more on a positive note a lot of times as well. So I wanted to ask you, is there something that gives you hope for the future? Some climate solution, something else, can be anything.
Well, I want to be optimistic. Perhaps it's not my nature to be unduly optimistic, but I think there are the technologies today that would enable us to operate in the sorts of lives we live now without the greenhouse gas emissions. Those technologies do exist, but they're expensive, more expensive than what we use today. So we need to, I think the technologies are there. We need to change the economics so that those technologies are competitive which I think they can be made competitive by there being more demand for them and more skills, knowledge of, so that when you replace your heating system in your house, a heat pump will be proposed to you in combination with solar panels on the roof. And of course, that's going to be a lot cheaper from a greenhouse gas point of view. It's going to be much better, and hopefully it would be cheaper to run, but it's often expensive to put in place. And that's the dilemma we've got now. We've got in front of us 20, 30 years of huge investments needed to reboot, reset our economy in a sustainable way. And that's going to be expensive. It's going to require money. The public purse will have to be contributing to that heavy investment, but it can be done.
That's already good to know, and sometimes good to remember as well that we have a lot of the things already in place to help us make steps forwards. And then things like the carbon pricing can then also help in some other sectors like now flying. But we will also see what happens with this new ETS and with CBAM. So lots of stuff happening there. But yes, thanks a lot for sharing all of your insights with us today. And thanks to you for listening and watching if you're watching it on YouTube, which this episode is also available on. All right.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal-net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.